I'm Khoi, and Ralph White has written a memoir titled Getting Out of Saigon, which chronicles his role in the evacuation of 113 South
Correct.
Vietnamese. I think I have with Ralph's help, we put together a program. It feels like my childhood, and for everybody who was around in the 60s and 70s, and I think that's most of us in this room. There are some iconic images. A Buddhist monk on fire, a crying naked girl running down a road, an execution by pistol shot to the head. When I tell people that my family escaped from Saigon in 1975, I wonder if this is the image that comes into people's mind, especially when I tell them that we got out by helicopter. Ralph, this picture was taken on April 29th, 1975. And I understand you went into Saigon on April 15th of 1975. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I probably was going the wrong way. Wrong way on a one-way street. Chase Manhattan Bank had a different kind of problem than the other American companies operating in Vietnam. Chase's general manager was a Dutchman, and he didn't believe that the United States Embassy would help him in the final days. Chase's problem was they needed an American to go in and take the helm of the branch. As it happens, I was working in Bangkok branch at the time. I'd just been assigned. I was the junior most officer in the entire bank.
50 years ago.
27 years old, and the adult, they'd asked a couple of other guys, and they'd laughed at them. And they asked me, and I said, sure, I'll do it. So I went in, and it was just that simple. It was almost like a case of mistaken identity. Why did they want me? There was no way I could run a Chase Manhattan branch. All I knew was accounting.
So I just want to, catch her. It's been 50 years. I'm going to give you a incredible nutshell of Vietnam War. So this is the country Vietnam. It's about 1,000 miles from southern tip to northern tip, about a third longer than the state of California. And in 1954, after the French lost the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam was partitioned. It was split in half at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, under communist rule led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam, a democratic republic backed by the United States. This led to the first exodus of Vietnamese refugees, actually. It's sometimes referred to as the Exodus of 1954. Somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million North Vietnamese moved to the south, primarily Catholics, to escape the communist rule. The partition of Vietnam was unacceptable to North Vietnam. Living under a totalitarian communist rule was unacceptable to South Vietnam. The spread of communism was unacceptable to the West. And so the resulting war was unimaginably expensive. The U.S., in today's dollars, the U.S. spent about $1 trillion in today's dollars just on the military costs. I don't even know what $1 trillion is. In terms of lives, U.S. soldiers, 58,000 killed. South Vietnamese soldiers, 250,000 killed. North Vietnamese soldiers, 1.5 million killed. Civilian deaths, 4 million. So it was an unsustainable war, cost and lives, and peace talks started in 1968. They progressed really slowly, 8 months just to agree on the shape of the conference table. But in January of 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and basically 3 tenets. Number 1, there's going to be a ceasefire. Number 2, the U.S. was going to withdraw everybody and leave behind a maximum of 50 military advisors. And number 3, North Vietnam would not send any more troops down into South Vietnam. Now, to get South Vietnam to sign on, President Nixon provided 2 main assurances in writing to President Thieu of South Vietnam. Number 1, the U.S. would continue to fund economic and military aid. And number two, any transgression by the North Vietnamese would lead to, quote, full force military retaliation by the United States. Now, we'll never know if Nixon actually meant to honor these two promises because in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which severely limited a president's ability to commit US military without congressional approval or a declaration of war. And then in 1974, Watergate led to the resignation of President Nixon. So emboldened by these developments in the US, North Vietnam, towards the end of 1974 and the beginning of 1975, sent troops down along the now infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. And in January of 1975, they launched an attack on Phuoc Lop, and they captured a province, and then they sat and they waited. President Ford asked for more funding for military aid, but it was turned down by Congress. So when there was no response from the United States, either with further aid or with a military action, Hanoi saw an opportunity for a final decisive blow to end the war. And they struck in the middle in Pleiku, where Ralph actually had spent a few years, some time in 1971, I believe.
Right. My first job out of college was in the Central Highlands of Vietnam.
And they severed the country. And then President Thieu, faced with the impossible task of defending 500 miles with spread out forces, made the maybe fatal decision to withdraw all his major military and to bring everybody back to position them south of that dotted line that you see. The military withdrawal devolved into a military and humanitarian crisis as the retreating troops competed for space along with a fleeing panicked populace. And so you had these hellish scenes of chaos that unfolded on roads, on the airfields, and in the seaports. That picture on the upper corner is of a ship, and actually I was impressed yesterday, Ralph knew the name of the ship. It's the Pioneer Contender. It was a ship taking some of the last refugees out of Da Nang. My father, who was the president of the University of Khoi up in the upper part of the country, was on that ship. And it was the trauma from that experience that played a major factor in our family's decision to try to escape from Vietnam just 1 week later. So this is unfolding through the end of March and through the beginning of April. And this, Ralph, this is the Vietnam that you were coming into.
Yeah, it's on the day that I arrived, there were 40,000 North Vietnamese troops 36 miles away from Saigon. I didn't know that. And I don't think David Rockefeller knew it. I don't think anybody at the Chase Manhattan Bank knew how close the enemy was. And just to a coda on Khoi's introduction, Vietnamese don't call, in their language, they don't call it the Fall of Saigon. They call it Black April.
Well, you know, now if you go back now, they call it the liberation of Saigon. So
right.
It depends who you're talking to. Yeah, but you're right. For those of us who are in this country, we refer to it as Black April. Yeah. Yeah. So now, what was your? How did you understand your task? I mean, this is your new office, I guess.
Yeah, Chase Manhattan Bank. So when I showed up, I had a double-barreled mandate. My first responsibility was to keep the branch open as long as possible. That was the first job. The second job was evacuate the senior staff if possible. So there was no manual of procedure. Again, all I knew was accounting. I had no particular skill. I grew up in a town of 6,000 people. There were 65 kids in my graduating class at Litchfield High School, Connecticut. I was a very small town boy. my father was a physician, but an alcoholic and a drug addict. One of the reasons I was 12 time zones away from Connecticut was to get away from my dad. I carried a gun. I carried a 38 Smith & Wesson revolver, and I carried $25,000 in cash in case I had to pay bribes.
So you had to declare this at customs.
Yeah. Yeah, you know,
I think that's above the limit.
in those days, you could fly with firearms. I mean, they didn't check. There was no. I'm not bragging about it. It was dumb. I don't recommend it. And I don't recommend paying bribes either. So I arrived on the 14th of February. Listen to me. April 1975, and the next day, I had a series of meetings at the embassy. All of the senior officers, the Foreign Service officers at the U.S. Embassy were on the 3rd floor. They had, it was 5 floors, but the 5th floor, they deemed it the safest one because infantry could attack from ground level and rockets came in from above. So all the senior guys wanted to be on the 3rd floor where they felt relatively safe. Of course, you weren't safe anywhere in Saigon.
Ralph, you've got this picture from the bank. How many people? So when you say you were the first priority is to get the senior management out, how many people is that?
Right. Well, there were 4 officers, Vietnamese. First of all, I was the only American in the office. So everyone else was Vietnamese. All the other expatriates had hightailed it. So there were 4 officers, a senior, a deputy general manager, and then 3 assistant managers. So my primary mission was to get them out because in 1968, during the Tet Offensive of '68, there had been massive, when North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam earlier, there had been massive civilian casualties. In Khoi, there were thousands of civilians who were just lined up and shot and rolled into muddy pits. And my employees were saying, you know, for God's sake, Mr. White, don't let them shoot us and roll us into muddy pits. Get us out of here. And the people who were saying that were not on my priority list. I was just supposed to get the senior people out.
How many people total at the bank?
Well, there were probably about 53 employees.
But you're also talking about their families too, right?
Right. There were 4 officers and their spouses and children. We didn't take parents or brothers, sisters out. And then there were 10 department heads, foreign exchange, customer service, that kind of thing. So we were going to try to endeavor to get them out as well and their families. I don't think it ever occurred to anybody in New York, Chase Manhattan's headquarters in New York, that all of the employees who wanted to get out would get out. Some of them didn't want to leave. I mean, they had aged parents. I wasn't taking parents if they're.
Explain to the people here, what were the obstacles getting out? I mean, Chase couldn't just write a check and say, we're going to pay for 100 plane tickets.
Well, you would think that would be the solution, right? Why wouldn't Rockefeller send his Gulfstream in and just ferry us out? In my first day at the embassy, the deputy chief of mission, Wolfgang Lehman, told me flat out, we aren't going to help you. The U.S. Embassy is not going to help you evacuate your Vietnamese staff.
Well, the reasons for that, right, were the laws, right?
The laws of South Vietnam prohibited any Vietnamese national from leaving the country without an exit visa. You all know about exit visas. You've watched the movie Casablanca. You know about letters of transit. You know, in Casablanca, everybody's trying to get letters of transit, and Humphrey Bogart hides, 2 of them in Sam's piano. Those were the documents that everybody in Saigon needed to get out, and they were unavailable at any price. There wasn't a bribe big enough to get
for us in Vietnam.
Visas.
There were 3 problems. The exit visa. We don't have passports. People in Vietnam didn't have passports. Number 1. So exit visa, passport, and then we had no place to go. So you don't just get an exit visa and go out. You got to go in somewhere else. Remember, so I'm just taking back, since 75, if you just go back 10 years before that, 1965, the US finally overturns the national origins quota. Remember that? There was an exclusion act in 25. Prior to 65, the kind of, if you didn't have like a spouse living in the US and you wanted to come from Asia, they let in 100 people a year. This isn't, so 65, this got turned over, right? But this is the world. So it's not just you had to get these people out of Vietnam, you had to, did Chase say, hey, this is where we want you to take them?
Well, there was also the little matter of commercial airlines that stopped flying in and out of Vietnam. Pan Am's Pan Am was the only commercial carrier, and they stopped flying a few days after I arrived.
April 24th, yeah.
So I wasn't sure how I was going to get out. Although Americans could leave any time, on military aircraft, I could hitch a ride on a military plane, but then I would have to leave all my people. My people, listen to me. All my employees. So
did you make kind of priority lists then, Ralph? You talked about like a couple of lists, A list and a B list.
So bear in mind, I wasn't assigned to that branch. I didn't know the people. I had just met them, sort of 24 hours before. So I didn't know any of their names. I can't pronounce their names. So I didn't know who to take. I didn't know who their families were. So I relied on Mr. Kung, who was our deputy general manager, to come up with a list. I found out later that he delegated the task to his deputy general manager. Minh Ya.
Yeah.
And
you did a good job with that.
I have practiced long and hard. Minh Ya. Because if you get it wrong, they make a face. It's another story how I linked up with them. I hope we get to that. So I was trying to get them. Commercial airlines had stopped flying. I considered stealing an airplane. I did have a pilot's license. I knew how to fly 2-seat airplanes with one propeller.
We're small people, but I don't know.
There was a DC-3 that I was planning on stealing out at the airport. I actually started up the engines to see if I could get it going. I was pretty sure I could get it off the ground.
Where would you go to?
To Thailand. There were Air Force bases in Thailand. I thought I could land it.
This Saigon here, and you can see there weren't a lot of evacuation routes. Okay, so the roads, if you go to the east, you get to the ocean. So that's probably what you wanted to do. But the problem is all those red arrows, all those are North Vietnamese troops. So the city is really surrounded. So there's not a land way out. Another way to get out would be to get on that river, you can see. And then the river takes you out the ocean. Actually, quite a few people got out that way towards the end. But so Ralph's, I think in your book, you looked at the river and you looked at air. These were your, but let's cut it. I don't want to spoil all the stuff in your book, all the cloak
I do
and
it all
dagger
the
stuff.
time.
But tell us about the actual evacuation when it happened, because I would like to hear about that, if that's not too much of a spoiler.
Let me relay how I discovered that there was a clandestine channel. First of all, I had nothing else to do at this branch. All I had, by the time I decided to close and I closed the branch on my own authority. I didn't ask anybody, I just did it. And then I had to get them out. And I had, there was an office on the same block, the same compound as the U.S. Embassy in the back part to the right. It was an old French villa with cracking plaster walls, And it housed an organization called the Mission Warden. I don't know if all embassies have mission wardens. It's basically a civilian police force. Most of them were ex-military guys. They did carry guns. They were tough-looking guys. They were wearing civilian clothing. Mission Warden. So I went in there. All I wanted to do was get the radio frequency that they were going to be using during an emergency in the final hours, because I wanted to listen to that radio to find out where the evacuation points were, so I could get out. So I'm sitting there talking to this ex-captain, Army captain, who had the same last name as I did, White, and and his Vietnamese secretary came in the middle of our conversation. He was typing on his desk, and his secretary came in and said, Captain White, I'd like to talk to you. And so I said, okay, I'll walk out. He said, no, I'll go. So he left, and then I was alone in his office. And I noticed there was an M16 automatic rifle leaning up against the wall with an ammunition clip in it. I mean, it was loaded. And this is not something that civilian contractors really are allowed to do. And then I thought, what is this? What's he typing? And so I got up, I walked around. I'm not wired, right? I walked around and I looked at the paper in his typewriter, and it was a flight manifest with Vietnamese names on it. And that was the first time that I knew that the U.S. Embassy was getting its Vietnamese employees out of the country. If he hadn't been called out, or if I'd gone out instead of him, I never would have found that. And then once I knew that, then I found the guy at the embassy who was responsible for the clandestine channel. I knew it had to be him because he was married to a Vietnamese, and he was a fluent Vietnamese speaker. And through him, I found the evacuation control center out at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. I met that guy. And so all of a sudden, I had a sort of a plan B. I still planned to steal a plane. But there was the evacuation control center, but the problem with the evacuation control center was that you could only take your dependents out.
Let's get to that evacuation day. So you got a phone call?
I got a phone call from Jim Ishida, who was the U.S. Embassy's commercial attaché. And he said, Ralph, I can get you, I forgot how many seats. He
70.
said 60, 70 seats on an embassy bus to get through the gate of the air base. Well, you know, that was really all I needed. I get it on the air base. I could put them all on my DC-3 and fly them to Thailand. And so that was still my plan A. And I got out there, and the DC-3 was gone.
This is a picture of not the bus that you were on, but there was a bus. This is taken by a news agency. These are the Vietnamese employees of CBS News. So they had a similar kind of deal. So you can see how anxious everybody is, because when you got on the bus, it wasn't that you just went to the airport. You had to go through the checkpoint. Okay. This is the checkpoint during much more quiet times, not during those last chaotic days. But the problem is that U.S., as they're recognizing that Vietnam is collapsing back in Washington, there is a high priority on getting the Americans out. And besides the Americans who are stationed there were about people, nobody was sure, but it was somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 roughly Americans who were teachers or missionaries or military contractors or ex-GI who had fallen in love with somebody and decided they were going to live in Vietnam. And they had acquired a number of Vietnamese families. And so these people said, well, we're not going to leave without our families. And there were some in the US who had people that they cared about in Vietnam. And they said, well, if we need to be there, we're going to fly back to help them get out. And so actually, it was going the wrong direction. The people there didn't want to leave, and people from the US wanted to fly back to try to get their people out. And so the US Embassy, and the foreign Relations Committee. All these groups in the House had no appetite, no enthusiasm for evacuating Vietnamese. So they met with Ford and they said, we need the Americans out, but we are not committing to an evacuation of Vietnamese people. But then they realized they're stuck, because if you don't agree to evacuate Vietnamese people, you're not going to get your Americans out. So then the Justice Department issued a parole status that said, if you had an American family member, they could, if you had an American parent or spouse, you could bring people out, so the dependents. And then they realized, well, people are going to come fly back then to still help people out. So then they changed it, said, if you could just vouch for them, you didn't have to be physically in Vietnam. And so Al Topping, who was the head of Pan Am in Vietnam, they made a movie about it. He adopted all 300 of his employees, for example, right? So Ralph, you're at the evacuation control center, and you've got to do some paperwork, I understand.
So I had split my employees into two groups. I couldn't take all of the employees and the families on one bus. So I had to pick, I didn't pick them. Again, I assigned it to Kung, and he assigned it to Ming Ya. They picked the top.
Nice job.
Because we thought if the senior people were caught there, they'd be executed. The junior people, they might put them in re-education camps, and they would survive. So it wasn't as heartless as it seems. But I did have the most vulnerable people. So I'm out at the air base. The plane is gone. So I go to the evacuation center, and they're only allowed to board Americans and dependents. And I got to the front of the line, and I really didn't know what I was going to say. So they had 5 vice consuls at conference tables processing papers. You're not married? Get in the yellow line. You need to adopt kids? Get in the red line. And then, so I followed one of the lines, got to the vice consul, and he said, passport? Give him my passport. What can I do for you, Mr. White? Well, I suppose you could help me get some Vietnamese out of here. Wife and kids? And I thought, well, there are wives in my group, there are kids in my group, but, technically I'm not lying. And I said, yeah, wife and kids. And he said, one page per, one form per person. How many forms do you need? I said, on the first outing, I said, 56. And then he looked up, and he said, how old are you? I said, I'm 27. You can't support 56 people. And I said, I have deep pockets. I'm thinking David Rockefeller's pockets, not mine. So he said, he thought, it was touch and go. And he picked up a handful of forms and shoved them at me, and he said, make sure you come back to this desk.
This is a copy of a form that a nun filled out. It's hard to find these forms, right? But a nun filled out, and you can see she had adopted a bunch of people, and they're all her children, and people were, and so then after you fill out paperwork and they're okayed, you have to wait there for the flight. And this is just a picture of Vietnamese people camped out, waiting for this series of U.S. Air Force flights. This is a picture that of people boarding, right? And it wasn't like going up a normal little stairs up into an airplane. You were getting on these cargo planes, right? Here's a picture, Ralph. You want to tell us about this?
Yeah, it's a curious, this is one of the most incredible things that's happened in my life, really. I was a first-time author, right? So Simon & Schuster, to Simon & Schuster, I'm nobody. So they picked a cover photo, and they did ask me if I liked it, but they were going to use it whether I liked it or not. And it was a nice one. It had reds and yellows. It would look like Miss Saigon, really, but it had a fixed-wing aircraft instead of a helicopter. And it was nice. It was attractive, pine trees on the horizon, and I said, sure, go with it. And then they came back to me a week later and said the sales department vetoed the cover photo, and so they asked me if I had any photographs that I could use on the cover, and I didn't, because I was carrying a gun and money. I wasn't carrying a camera, and so I did what you would do. I went on my computer and I Googled. I went to Getty Images and I searched Vietnamese refugees, Fall of Saigon. Click, and I got about 800 hits, and some of them were blurry, black and white. Some were helicopters, which didn't describe us. Some of them were refugee camps. And then I came across this one, and it was crisp and clear, and they had these three cute kids in the front, and boarding a plane just like my group did. And I sent it to Simon & Schuster, and my editor said, yeah, we can use that. And they went with it. They published the book. A couple of months later, my phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Houston, Texas. Well, I don't know anybody in Houston, Texas, except an old drinking buddy, and I didn't want to pick that phone up. But against my better judgment, I picked it up, and it said, hello, Mr. White. My name is Lintinya. And she said, I thank you. You take me out of Vietnam during Black April. And I said, who's this? And she said, Lintinya, you remember me. I said, and I didn't. And she said, yeah, I lost my luggage, and you took me to the PX and bought me a dress and a toothbrush. And I remember I did that. And I said, wow, that's amazing. And she said, Mr. White, thank you for putting my children on the cover of your book. And I said, who's this? Lintinya. And she said, yeah, my Vien and my An. And I said, are you sure those are your kids? I know my kids. So we had a nice conversation. I hang up. It's like 3 or 4 days later, it hits me. If those kids came out with her, she came out with me. That's the plane I came out on April 27, 1970. And I picked it up randomly after the first cover had been vetoed by Simon & Schuster. And I thought, something's going on here.
So Vietnamese people are evacuated Clark Air Force Base in Philippines, which was illegal because the Philippines did not grant permission, and then transferred to Tent City in Guam. I just wanted to, and this is young Ralph there on the side.
On the right.
28, pretty good-looking young adventurer. It looked exactly the same if you took the mustache off. And this is Ralph reunited with, preparing for this was obviously an emotional thing for me too. And these are a number of the kind of unsung heroes behind Ralph's book. Homer Smith in the top corner was the person who came up with the idea for the affidavits. Chapman
Commanding General.
And Lanigan were people who set up barges. There's a Moorfield, who was at the evacuation control center, helped process these people. The guy with the 2 children, he's Rick Armitage, who became Deputy Secretary of State. But he was sent to scuttle 30 the South Vietnamese Navy so it wouldn't fall in communist hands, and he actually was able to get all 30 boats full of refugees out to the open sea. So he engineered the rescue of 30,000 people. And that's Loman getting a... This is my family right before we left. And so we left just a few days before Ralph got there. It was illegal to leave. And so on April 2nd, my parents went to work, I went to school, my sister went to school, but we actually didn't go. We all diverted and met at that cathedral. I was the first person to show up. I waited there. Then my sister and mother came, and my father was the last. We said a prayer, and then we walked 2 blocks to the home of the director of Mobil Oil, who had arranged for us to have a helicopter out of the airport. One of the last person who found out that we were leaving was our banker, because my mother had come to change some currency the day before. So he came by to say goodbye and good luck. And that person is Cornelius Termaine, who was the predecessor for Ralph. We got to the airport and we ran into that checkpoint problem. My father was sitting in front with Peter Gelpke from Mobil Oil and his driver, and my mother was in the back with my sister and myself. And we were hoping in that we would show Peter Gelpke's white face and we would be allowed on because it was a Mobil Oil car. But the guard just pointed to my mother. He said, he just pointed to my mother, does she have a pass? And we thought, well, that's the end of the rope for us. And my mother reached into her bag and she pulled out an airport pass. It's like pulling out an ace out of the hole. And it turned out that she was a lawyer. She had done a favor for somebody the year before and refused payment, but to save face, he's a government official, he gave her an airport pass to pay for, and it was in the glove compartment of our car. And the night before, my father couldn't sleep because who's going to sleep when the night before you leave your country? And he remembered this, so at 2 in the morning he went to the dashboard of our car and he put it in my mother's purse. She's the only one in the car who had an airport pass.
I think she was the only one in the country.
Yeah. So, I just want to say another thing. So we're 130,000 people. It was an amazing evacuation, okay? The flights that Ralph and his crew got on, by the end of April, 45,000 people had been evacuated by the US Embassy and other groups. On the last day, those famous helicopters, because the runway had been bombed at that point, the helicopters got out over 6,000 Vietnamese people, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. 70,000 Vietnamese were rescued at sea during that month. So it had 130,000 people. Now, we have no country and we have no place to go. Most of the people in Guam. A Gallup poll is taken in the United States. Are you in favor of admitting these people? Only 36% said yes. George McGovern gave a speech. He said 90% of these people should be sent back to Vietnam. And he wanted to propose legislation to fund the ships and planes to bring people back. Now, 36% of 210 million still means that you got 70 to 80 million people who want to help you out. And we were lucky because one of those 70, 80 million was Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford had the moral courage to stand up to Congress. And he got Congress to approve on May 18th the Indochina Migrant and Resettlement Act. He pushed it through. And in fact, his powers of conviction were such that in House it passed 380 to 31, and in Senate only 2 senators voted against it. So really think about the power of the president to do something like. And I, as many of you know, I practice cardiology out here. When I came here in '96, one of my patients became Betty Ford. And I always thought, when Gerald Ford was giving those speeches and lobbying for us, that he didn't realize that, there's this 14-year-old boy out there who he's impacting, who would someday take care of his wife. And so it was, yeah.
So I ended up coming out with my refugees. I boarded the flight. When I went at the air base after I after I sent the first group out, I ran into Jim Ishida, the same guy who had offered me the seats on the bus. And he said, Ralph, I can get you another 70 seats for tomorrow's bus. So I'm thinking, hey, I've checked out of the hotel. I'm out of here. I was going to go with my refugees. But I thought about it, you know, I won't get a very good reception back at 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza or St. Peter's Gate if I leave the rest of them here. So I went back into Saigon, and then the next day I picked up the rest of them, and I came out with them. I boarded this plane, the one you saw.
The second plane, yeah.
I came out with them, and we were airborne, and I realized I didn't know what country we were going to. I was on a military cargo jet, lying on the floor of a cargo jet with 300 refugees. And when we landed, I saw a uniformed, an Air Force sergeant. I said, Airman, what country is this? And he looked at me, he said, it's the PI, sir. I said, I don't know, Philippine Islands. And we stayed at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines for something like three days. And then President Marcos kicked us out. And we ended up going to Guam, and we stayed in a tent city of 30,000 refugees. I stayed with them. I slept on cots with my refugees in the refugee camps. And then we boarded a commercial plane and went to Camp Pendleton in Southern California, where they got green cards, and then came back to...
And Chase really looked after these people.
Chase, by that time I had linked up with other Chase officers and International Human Resources. They were, because, well, I'm leaving the punchline. We got back to New York. David Rockefeller thanked me and gave me an award, and gave all of the Vietnamese I brought out, gave them jobs.
And you got a promotion?
You know, I had just been promoted to the most junior officer around, so I didn't feel as though I deserved much more than that. But I see we have 1 minute left. Did you want to cover something, or can I tell about meeting my Vietnamese refugees now?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I tried hard to relocate them because I stayed overseas. I worked in Vietnam, I worked in Bangkok, I worked in Hong Kong. And by the time I came back, I'd lost track of all of them. And I went to a Lunar New Year festival in New Jersey, hoping to run into some. And I ran out of, I ran out of ideas. So I sat down, I got a beer, sat down and gave up. And a young woman came over and said, "What are you doing here?" Because everybody was Vietnamese. And I said, "I'm looking for my refugees." And she said, "Well, do you know somebody named Ming Ya?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "She's my friend. Here, you're talking to her." And that's how the story ends.
Ralph, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.